Our guest today, Dame Evelyn Glennie, is a virtuoso solo percussionist who travels the globe playing and recording with the world's finest orchestras and ensembles. She is notably recognized as the first musician to maintain a full-time career as a solo percussionist. Evelyn is also profoundly deaf and has honed her awareness of sound to such a degree that she describes her body as a resonating chamber. As the world's premier solo percussionist, Evelyn has been honored with multiple awards, including two Grammys and numerous other awards, too many to mention. So thank you so much for chatting with us this morning. And I'd like to just start out so that we sort of set the scene, because it gives perspective to anything else, to have you talk a little bit about when and how you became deaf.
Yes, I began losing my hearing from the age of 8, and I had mumps round about the age of 6, 7 years old, but we're unsure whether that was the cause of it. And over the following perhaps 4 years or so, I found that my hearing was just steadily declining. And but at the age of 8, I started playing piano, and I was brought up in a farm in the northeast of Scotland, and many farmhouses had pianos because a lot of the social time that happened back then was that relatives would come to visit you, and inevitably they would sing traditional music, Scottish traditional music, or they might play the accordion, play the piano, play the fiddle, sing, recite poetry, do some traditional dancing. And that was really quite normal. And so a lot of the households did have musical instruments. So our house, farmhouse, had an upright piano. And my mother could play the piano. She could read music, but she didn't have a very good ear. My father, on the other hand, who was the youngest of 14, had a very good ear for Scottish music, but he couldn't read music. So, and he left school at the age of 14 and immediately started working on farms. And so I think deep down he had this passion for the traditional music, and he used to play the accordion as well. By the time I was born and my two brothers were born, my older brothers, he had stopped playing altogether. So we never actually saw him play the accordion or indeed the piano. So, but when he saw that I was interested in music, because my whole musical upbringing started by playing by ear, really, so listening to the music on the TV, the advert music, observing what people were playing when they came to visit. And also I went to a two-teacher country school, a primary school that only had two teachers and I think 37 pupils in the whole school. And this meant that every Friday, the whole school had a music lesson. So by the time we left that school at the age of 11, 12, we could all actually read music. So, in a
Unbelievable.
way, the timing of losing or beginning to lose my deafness and understanding about music and participation of music and receiving music, the oral aspect was already there. So, and I think that's very important because I understood about placement of sound. I understood about acoustics. I understood about dynamics and accents and phrasing, the musical phrase, and that sense of touch, and the participation of music and all the different kind of attacks that you have with music, whether you're blowing into a recorder or singing using your voice or striking a chime bar or something. You were aware of how you could participate in music. And that was very important. However, by the time I was 12 years old, or 10 years old, really, I was using hearing aids. And when I went to a secondary school, a much bigger secondary school, I was very dependent on the aids. But what I found was that when I started percussion at the age of 12, I suddenly immersed in this much larger world that went beyond the piano playing. So a lot more instruments that had wider frequency ranges and many different attacks. So you're dealing with short, sharp sounds to sounds that were very low and elongated, very reverberant. And I found that this was very confusing with the aids. So I was hearing a lot of sound, but not the clarity. And I found it very difficult as regards to where the sound was coming from. And as a player, I found that my sense of touch was completely being lost. So inside, I, I felt myself being a very sensitive player because I knew about touch, but because I was struggling to hear things and deciphering the kind of complexities of sound, I was really, trying to strike things harder and harder and harder. So everything was getting louder and louder, and it was almost like overload in this part of the body. And I remember my percussion teacher, and he said, Evelyn, what would happen if you take your hearing aids out? And of course, I couldn't quite believe what he was saying. And he said, just take them out, and I'm going to strike this timpani, and I'd like you to place your hands on the wall of the tiny little music room. And that's exactly what I did. And I could not believe that not only could I pick up the attack of the stick, my teacher striking the timpani, but actually I could feel that through my hand, but perhaps more importantly, the resonance of the sound. So that was still continuing through my hand, but it wasn't coming through the ear. And as you changed the pitch of the drum, you could determine that pitch. Obviously, I wasn't skilled enough to say that was a C or a D flat or a G or whatever, but I knew that there was a difference as regards to the pitches that I was feeling through the hand. And this really was a complete and utter revelation. It was a completely different entry point to perceiving sound and understanding sound and having the patience with sound. So, and for me, it opened up this blanket that, or uncovered a whole kind of landscape whereby dynamics no longer had to be judged on what you could hear or not hear, because I was actually feeling the softest of softest dynamics if I was paying attention and if I was in the right kind of position to perceive that dynamic. So as the years went by, really dynamics for me have been incredibly important. And, I see dynamics as, the kind of the variation in color. And when you open yourself up to thinking of the space that you're in as your instrument rather than the marimba or the xylophone or the vibraphone or the drum kit or whatever, but when you see that space as your instrument, dynamics are suddenly they have a different dynamic really themselves. You can give a dynamic to a certain part of a room. You can give a dynamic to the people who are sitting up in the balcony. You can give a dynamic to the people sitting in the front row. You can give an illusion of a dynamic and not actually create any sound, but yet the audience, through their body language, will be thinking, is there, isn't there? And so their imagination plays a part in how a piece of music is interpreted. So I think that really that whole kind of step of trying to hear the sound to then trying to feel the sound and realizing that the aids, and of course nowadays hearing aids are much more sophisticated than they were then, but nevertheless, it was important to get that body working, and having the support system through a teacher who was willing to work with you, to make this journey something that you could actually participate in.
Yeah, and can I just sort of remark on the fact that, as you've just mentioned, hearing then to you became much more than just something that you do with your ears. It was that particular aspect of it, but it was also the sensation, the vibrations in various parts of your body. And the third part of the equation, as you've written about before, is sight, which gives a whole new paradigm of listening. And really sort of remarkable. And the other thing I wanted to just point out, which seems remarkable to me, is first of all, you came to that school, Ellen Academy. Ron Forbes was your teacher. That the series of events where he was intuitive enough to consider how you may be able to use those instruments in a non-traditional way to actually experience them. And as you said, that whole process took a great deal of patience, and along with that, a great deal of drive, of impetus on your part. It absolutely astonishing. But maybe you would talk a little bit more about that whole sense of hearing and sight. You mentioned that the audience sometimes will lean forward in expectation that something is happening, and of course that speaks to your own performances where it's you're playing the marimbas or some other percussion instrument, and the audience is reacting a lot to what you're doing, not only with the sticks and the sound they're hearing, but with your whole body.
Well, I think that, when you think about, the word music and what does that mean, we always relate music to sound, something that you hear, something that you listen to, something that you enjoy or you want to participate in. But it's always linked to that sense of hearing. And I think that when you really sort of zoom out of music, I mean, you're talking about the physics of sound, you're talking about acoustics, you're talking about uh, design, instrument design, building design. You're talking about the whole mechanics of the physical body and how it relates to sound, how it manipulates sound, how it gives sound, how it registers, understands sounds, how it imagines sounds, all sorts of things like that. And I think it's fascinating also to think about the geography of sound, the history of sound as well. I often think about, well, what might a vibraphone sound like in 100 years' time? What might a violin sound like in 100 years' time? What sort of capacity might we be engaging in live performances? I mean, it's extraordinary to think that, we're having this conversation through Zoom, through a technical means, and we've got captions here and we can have this conversation. Would we have imagined that 100 years ago? Maybe not. So I think that there's always this sense of curiosity in the teaching world, in any kind of craft that we decide to engage ourselves in. We have to kind of keep thinking, how can we be part of that sort of feeling of wanting to push the boundaries in what we do. So I could just say, well, I'm a musician and I give concerts. That's what I do. And I learn the repertoire and then I go off and I give the concert and then I go home again. I could box myself up in that situation. Or I could think much more broadly and think, well, really, what am I? What is a musician? What does that actually mean? What ingredient am I using? Sound. What is sound? And what does that do to people? So, and I think that was one of the reasons why the Evelyn Glennie Foundation really organically came about, which is all about to teach the world to listen. Because I found that, in my own upbringing, my family listened to me. So they didn't send me to a school for the deaf. They said, no, let's just see what happens at a mainstream school. My percussion teacher and my music classroom teacher, they listened to me because they had that, sort of intuition to say, place your hands on the wall, see what happens. There was a curiosity there. And, that the whole kind of journey has been this kind of building blocks, if you like, of making sure that everything connects, and listening is about connection. It's about curiosity, it's about focus, it's about concentration, but ultimately it starts with yourself, listening to what is inside of yourself and allowing that kind of conversation that you have with yourself, time and space to be registered. And we kind of lack that at this point because we're so distracted by one thing or another that we've kind of lost that ability to listen to ourselves. And I know that as a musician, as you go into music institutions and you go into the practice rooms and you see iPads or tablets set up in each room, and it allows the students to go onto YouTube to find, different performances of the repertoire that they're playing. What are the advantages of that? What are the disadvantages of that? And I'm finding, as someone who often mentors young musicians or I'm asked to give consultations or whatever, is that a lot of that is actually eroding their sense of self-discovery, the faith in what they feel themselves, because they can so easily go onto social media and look at someone else's performance and think, oh, that looks interesting, or that's how they set their instruments up, so I'll do that too because so and so is doing it, rather than, well, hold on a second, I'm 5'2". This is my arm stretch. This is what I'm perceiving. This is how I want to interpret the music. So taking that faith from your own sort of journey is really, really crucial. And then by all means, you can sort of see what else you can bring externally into your own system. But listening really is very much part of kind of fishing out what is inside of you and getting that out. It's almost like bringing a technique to your body rather than forcing the body into that technique. And it's the same with perceiving sound. So I might perceive a bass drum in my particular way, and it will be very different to how an audience member feels a bass drum, because I'm on this side of the bass drum. I've already imagined the sound in my head. I'm already holding the bass drum mallet. I'm the one bringing that mallet down onto the skin. I'm the one physically feeling that initial sound through my hand and so on. And then it gets transferred to the audience. So there's no way that we're feeling exactly the same thing. Of course not. So we can't just box this up by saying, well, can you feel that? Or can you hear that? Let someone digest this, reflect on it, and then just immerse themselves in that sort of soundscape and let them make their own sort of decision or their own feelings as regards to their connection to that sound.
It's interesting because you have mentioned in one of your videos that, and perhaps it was the TED Talk, that if someone were to lie underneath the marimba, they would have a completely different sound experience than you're actually having playing it, because they're underneath the pipes, and it would be very different. I wonder whether you have any thoughts about sound therapy along those lines. And that was just something that occurred to me in passing. I don't know that's particularly important, but I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, I mean, sound therapy is incredibly important. And it's very interesting to think about sound therapy and music therapy. And we know that music therapy is extremely important in so many contexts. I mean, we can think about dementia, for example, and think about music therapy and how crucial and important that is. I would love to develop something whereby we think about linking sound therapy to people with dementia. So thinking about, for example, what was the sound world of that particular individual. They might have been a train driver or a plumber, or they might have been a shopkeeper or an engineer or something. So what was the kind of sound world that they were exposed to? Because it's not always possible, for a family to have musicians who can play wartime tunes or something, or play something that might have been as far as a piece of music or a song or something. But when we're thinking about the creation of sounds, that is something that could potentially be more accessible to families within the home, within a care home context even. So I think there's an enormous amount of research that can be done, both sound therapy and with music therapy. I think the thing about percussion, however, is that, we're exposed to instruments that are very small or very large, exposed to instruments that have all different kinds of frequencies, attacks, dynamics, resonances, and so on. And they're also very adaptable instruments. So they're instruments whereby they can be adapted to fit on a wheelchair, or they can be adapted to be put on a table or something in order to allow people to access. So, for example, we've seen that gamelan, for example, especially the Javanese gamelan, which is a slower style than the Balinese gamelan, which is very frenetic, is really great for people who might have had a brain injury. Because there is time to strike that instrument and to be in a position whereby they're sitting down on the floor, sitting on the ground, and these big gongs, are kind of their ears in a way, and it just engulfs their whole body, but there's time to register the sound. And so very little has to be kind of adapted in order for people to participate in the likes of some Javanese music. But I think that it's again, you see, this is where music belongs to us all. Listening belongs to us all, and it is our responsibility, to connect with people through listening. So we don't need to hinge ourselves on a sound when it comes to listening. It's that real presence. You can be in a room that has no sound, but if there's the willingness to be present, then it's an extraordinary kind of connection that can happen. I think when you think of John Cage's 4 minutes 33 seconds, for example, whereby he thought there was going to be no sound whatsoever, to discover that actually there was an awful lot of sound and he couldn't quite get rid of that sound. The sound of his chatter up here, the sound of his heartbeat, just everything beating in his body and whatever, that it was quite an experience, and it made him realize that, well, there's no such thing as silence, but there's the illusion of silence. So, and I think that when it comes to deafness, we imagine people living in a world of silence all of the time, and deafness means you cannot hear anything. And that's not really often the case at all. It's trying to decipher, the meaning of that sound, and it's having the time to connect with that sound. So when we're thinking about audiologists, for example, one of the things that we've been working on at Manchester University is to bring the audiology students and the music students together in order for the audiology students to ask the musicians, well, when you're in a practice room and you're practicing a phrase, and I can see that you're playing all the right notes, what else is there to do? You can play the right notes. So what are you actually practicing? And so they're discovering the real nuances, of a thin sound and just a slightly thicker sound. So what does that mean in the kind of physicality of playing that? What does that mean in the perceiving of the sound? What does that mean in the projection of the sound in a dry acoustic or in a wet acoustic, or when the audience is right there, or the audience is in the round, or the audience is up in a balcony, or you're in an outdoor venue? What does that look like and feel like? So it's really trying to understand that when hearing is measured in a kind of controlled room, when that person then walks out into a busy street or in their family home or whatever it might be, what does that look like? So how can the measurement of hearing connect to the everyday kind of life? And how can we perhaps bridge that a little bit more as far as the understanding in the mechanics of hearing and then the devices that we actually use?
Certainly, concert venues, the ones you use, have vastly different acoustic properties, and I'm thinking specifically of indoor versus open air. But of course, even the indoor facilities are extremely different. How can you tell when a venue is less than ideal, and how does this affect your performance?
Well, I'm not really looking at venues that are less than ideal or more so. I mean, this is the space that you're in. This is what you have to work with. And so I think that if you're trying to uh, judge acoustics, that I think is an area that, are we in a position to do that, first of all, and judge it from what perspective? Judge it from the perspective of playing a snare drum or playing a piano or speaking or singing or whatever. So for me as a multi-percussion player, acoustic could be wonderful for the triangle, but maybe a nightmare for a drum kit or something. So I don't want to be kind of in this sort of landscape where I'm thinking all of the time something is going to work well, something is not going to work well. This is what I have, and the overall picture is that this is how I want to project the piece to the audience. And it's very different playing to an audience than it is making a recording. First of all, the type of tools that are used are different than if you're making a recording and you're in that kind of environment. I think this is why it's quite difficult nowadays when you accept doing a performance, because they'll want to say, oh, and we would like to stream this, and we'd like to record this for radio, and we would like this broadcast for blah, 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 blah. So you don't know, are you playing to the microphone? Are you playing to the audience? Are you working with the acoustic? What are you doing? And that's very difficult to negotiate, because each one is an art form in itself. So, but I think for me, if it's a dry acoustic, you accept that this is a dry acoustic. Therefore, the types of mallets that I might use could be much heavier and much more soft, rather than a hard kind of attack where there's absolutely no resonance. Also, the physicality of playing gives the illusion that there's resonance there. Now, that's quite different than if I was playing, for example, at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, whereby, the reverberation is, I don't know how many seconds. So, of course, I'm not going to turn up with timpani or multi-drums and things like that. It will be a complete mess. So that's an inappropriate situation to be in. But I would perhaps take a marimba or a vibraphone, and I would choose repertoire that is much more in keeping and appropriate for that type of acoustic. So, that's what I mean by it. It's almost like, you know, going to a McDonald's or something, or a fast food place, and suddenly somebody serves you, £100 bottle of wine. You'd think, hold on a second, I'm having a hamburger here, and there's this very expensive wine, and the two just wouldn't quite go together, and it would seem really odd, in the same way that if you turned up at a very, very expensive posh restaurant and it came in a kind of takeaway box, you think, oh, I don't think so. So I think that you're always planting the repertoire in the kind of room that you think you're going to be in.
I wonder whether we can back up and just have you very, very briefly talk, just so that our audience can understand when you say vibrations. If you could just explain about the specific parts of your body, and then a sort of a follow up to that is, with the different percussion instruments that are available to you, 3,800 in your collection, and I'm sure you've played many of them. Are the vibrations different for each instrument, significantly different to you in how you feel them? And is there an emotional component to that for you that affects your performance as an artist?
Well, I mean, it's a question that there isn't a set answer, but the basics of it really is that low sounds are felt in the lower part of your body. So if you're playing bass drums, timpani, or you're beside a double bass or a tuba or something, most of those sounds will be felt in the lower part of your body, and they will resonate quite considerably. So I much prefer low sounds because you've got that time to digest them. And also, usually, not always, but usually the instruments are bigger, and usually the kind of physicality of playing those instruments use a greater part of the body. So something like a triangle, glockenspiel, cymbals, xylophone, snare drum to an extent are all felt in the kind of mid and upper range of your body. So that's more difficult to decipher. It's more difficult to get the kind of nuances of the sounds, because it is just all kind of up here. And that's not to say that when I play the marimba, for example, and actually I'm practicing a piece at the moment whereby there's a certain register of the marimba that just sort of strikes the face, just your cheekbones and up here, and it's almost as though when you get the tempo right, it's almost as though you're a squirrel and you're putting loads and loads of nuts in your mouth, and your cheeks are getting further and further out. That's what the sound does. However, for someone else that may not happen. It might be that they use different mallets. It might be that their whole action, physical action, is different. So this is why we all have our sound. We all have our own way of creating that sound. So just because I might feel a bass drum through, let's say, my feet or my thighs or something, doesn't mean that someone else will feel that sound in exactly the same place. They might be wearing something different. Their shoes might be different. There could be all sorts of things. It could be that they're just simply not used to being beside that particular instrument. So it's not the case whereby for example, if I play a marimba that is made by a certain make, and then I go to another place and I play exactly the same marimba, I will probably not feel that marimba in quite the same place in the body than I did perhaps in the privacy of my own four walls. So it's always changing, and vibration is like a river. It's always moving. It's going through air. It's a living thing. So that's why listening is the here and now. It's happening now, then it's gone. So, the past is always kind of knocking on the future. So that present is just present for an nth of a second, and then it's in the past. So as a player, I don't try to remember what I did in the past. Everything has to be new, a fresh perspective. This is the first time I played a piece. This is my first time with the instrument. This is the first time in this space. It always has to have that fresh perspective, because that listening aspect, as I say, is happening right now.
I know that fresh perspective is something that you've commented on before, particularly about your preparation for concerts, and you very much prefer that those experiences remain as extemporaneous as possible, even though you obviously have to rehearse things.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting with rehearsals because, we often rehearse in an empty space, in an empty room, in an empty hall, in an empty theatre. We practice in an empty room, normally just ourselves, or maybe part of a group. But a lot of the preparation is done in a solitary situation, and then you go to the concert hall and you practice in an empty hall, and then you give the performance. So that important point to a hall that's full of people, or certainly has people in it. And so you're always negotiating your sound. But the most important thing is that, sound is only one element of a live performance. It entails more than that kind of communication, that willingness to embrace the audience, to embrace the music, to work as a team, to do the best you can for that piece of music. The sound is just one part. I mean, we could say, well, let's try a concert whereby we ask the audience to completely turn themselves around, or indeed for the musicians to turn themselves around so that actually they have their backs to the audience. How would the connection to that performance vary? You know what I mean? How would our listening vary to that concert? What would our memory be of that concert? Might it be, wow, they all had their backs to us, rather than, wow, the interpretation of the music was amazing? Would we still be saying the same things? And I think this is quite interesting when you're working with people in a workshop scenario, and just thinking about, well, what are we as musicians, and what are the senses that are most important when we connect with each other? And it's every sense. It really is every sense. It is, what we perceive orally. It's what we feel physically. It's what we see through sight. It's what we kind of sense and smell, that distance between each other. It's this peripheral vision that goes on. It's this kind of awareness thing. It's faith, it's trust, it's instinct, it's all sorts of things like that come into play. But we don't talk about those things when we learn an instrument. You know what I mean? We don't think about kind of listening in that situation when we're learning a piece of music. It's right, let's get the notes in the right place and in the right rhythm and make sure we're counting the bars and so on. And then, oh, make sure you're playing softly, or play a little more softly. Well, what kind of soft do you want? Do you want a fragile soft, a thin soft, a scary soft, a misty soft, an offstage soft? What kind of soft do you want? But this is really important, when we're thinking about the language and how we connect with what we do as musicians.
Uh, Absolutely fascinating that there are all those things being computed, at the same time. I want to go back to the early part of your career and talk about something that really leads into the whole rest of your career and your life, and that is while you were at the Royal Academy in the early 1980s, which, by the way, I will mention, you were initially rejected and then accepted there. But solo percussion pieces were very much a niche area of the music world. But you had this desire to be a solo percussionist, and at a very young age, I think you were still in your teens at the time, you developed relationships with performing groups, and you commissioned composers to write new music for you. So, what combination of personal factors gave you such a strong sense of purpose that early in your career?
When I was 15 and decided I wanted to be a solo percussionist, that aim was very, very simple. So it was simple to understand. I want to be a solo percussionist. That's a very clear aim. How to get there was another matter. However, having that aim almost tattooed on your forehead made it very easy to drive your energy towards that aim, and thinking, right, what can I do to make this happen? What do I need to do to make this happen? How do I visualize a solo percussionist? What does that look like in your mind? And all of those things need time to just kind of register and seep through your system. So, and you already know that you're a solo percussionist. So it's not a case of I want to be, or I will be, or in 5 years' time I will be. You already are, because it's already in your head and you're visualizing it. And I think that's very important. And it means that when people say, I don't think that's going to be possible, you can completely negate that and say, no, it's already here. So we're past that. That is not a conversation we can have. It's already happening. So you move on from that and don't kind of spend the energy trying to debate this or that. And then, of course, when I was a student at the Royal Academy, there were no solo percussionists. And things like, for example, the first year we were allowed to put our name down to play a concerto. So this was open for any first year student. So I put my name down just to be told, well, actually, no, this is not really open for percussion players, because we wouldn't expect a professional orchestra, to be playing percussion concertos. And so immediately I said, well, you have to make that clear then. Does that apply to tuba? Does it apply to organ? Does it apply to harp? Does it apply to bassoon? But you need to make that clear. Oh, but maybe there are bassoon concertos, or maybe there are double bass concertos. So that was not an acceptable answer. So my kind of answer, as it were, to the situation was to commission one of the student composers to write a percussion concerto. And that was the first ever percussion concerto in the history of the Academy, and it was over 100 years old at that point, the history of the Academy. So bit by bit, and it's what we talked about earlier about just these building blocks towards your aim. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's just this little block. Or I remember again as a student, where I would go to play with amateur orchestras throughout London, and you would just get your bus fare, covered, and that would be it. And I was playing in the percussion section at the back of the orchestra, and I knew that I didn't want to be in an orchestra, but the purpose, and there was always a purpose, was that I would then go up to the conductor to say, have you ever played a percussion concerto? And they would look look at me as though I'd landed from Mars. And they said, no, are there any? And of course, I might be able to name, two or three, but not many. But nevertheless, it was just that planting of the seed, and to inform the conductor that actually there are percussion concertos. And if you decide to think about programming a concerto, please let me know. I'd really like to play. So, it again, that's sort of the purpose of doing the job in the first place, and then creating the opportunity to plant a seed that is towards your goal. So that was really what was happening. And that remains the case to this day. It doesn't matter whether you're just starting out or whether you've been in the profession a long time. We've all got to kind of contribute, as it were, to, as I say, the pushing of the boundaries, or the kind of curiosity in what you do, or that feeling of making a difference, just keeping things moving towards as long as it's towards a purpose that you really believe in.
As you've mentioned before, and I was very interested to hear you sort of elaborate on the musical training that you got for 1 or 2 years at your first school, and you came away with all of these, as you described, sort of artistic concepts that not everyone would get. Then you have the desire later on to choose percussion, and then to make your way with the purpose that you've just described. So now, as someone who has redefined, as what's possible for musicians with disabilities, what advice would you have for others who face similar challenges, who maybe don't have all of the tools that you've acquired along the way?
There's a lot of advice that can be given, of course, but ultimately it's to understand what industry are you in. And I think that one of the challenges is that we assume that if you're a musician, you just have to show that you're adept at playing your instrument. And I think there's a big danger here. Of course, that's a massively important thing. We have to be adept at playing our instrument. But nevertheless, we also have to be adept at knowing what industry we're in, and what does that mean? What does it look like? Because only playing your instrument is not enough. And therefore, I do feel that sometimes then use the disability to say, well, that's why I'm not getting the work, or that's why I'm not getting on, or whatever. And it's sometimes because we've forgotten to take care of the rest of the industry that we're in. So when we talk about practice, for example, what are we actually talking about? We're taught that, well, to practice, you've got to spend X amount of hours with your instrument, and you practice your scales and arpeggios and your pieces, and you do this and that on your instrument. And then once you've practiced for 5 hours or 8 hours or whatever it might be, you then shut the door and you say, congratulations. And well, not really, actually. It's okay, but that's only one aspect of the industry that you're going into. So for me, practice needs to be much, much more broad. And practice means, yes, attending to your instrument and all the aspects about that instrument. But it also means, reading up on the industry magazines, making sure that what does music management mean? What does that look like? How are you going to approach a promoter? Oh, what is happening in the season, with such and such an orchestra, if you're interested in that, and all sorts of things. Going to talk with musicians and the management people and say, well, and have these questions ready, so that you're really kind of building your knowledge up in the industry that you're actually going in. And I think that is something that when the pandemic happened, when we're all thrown up in the air, and then afterwards we all kind of landed in different places, and we thought, oh gosh, now what does the world look like? And for the industry that I'm in, it was obviously, as with many industries, a complete shock. But there's always a yin and yang to everything. And I felt that really it shook the industry up in ways that, yes, were not always great, but at the same time, there were ways in which we really were able to think outside of the box. And I think it opened up the possibilities of what we believe a musician is. And of course, you know, we've seen so many things happening online. We've seen recordings made where people don't have to be in the same room. We've seen so many wonderful kind of uh, creativity that's happened from people who don't even play instruments, but who are whizzes with IT and sound. And so we are worried about how much music is or how music education has been impacted in our schools and how it's being reduced, and the peripatetic instrumental teachers and so on are getting thinner and thinner. But we've also got to see that actually a lot more young people are in fact engaging with music through IT and getting into composing for computer games and films and all of that kind of thing, even if they're not playing instruments. So, you know, again, we've got to think, well, what does our industry consist of? And that's really important. So the advice I would give is explore your industry and keep kind of interrogating what it means to be a musician.
Earlier, we talked about a new way of hearing or listening. And as you've noted in, I think, one of your essays, as you start to elucidate that, it tends to move into the philosophical. And that philosophy is something that you carry into your work with the Evelyn Glennie Foundation, which reaches into education, health and care, cultural initiatives, community development, even the workplace, striving to make better listeners and better lives. Just talk about that and tell us how that works.
Absolutely. And interestingly, when you mention a new way of listening, that this really, it's, I don't see this as being a new way of listening at all. If you think about, you know, Beethoven, for example, and, you know, when he was losing his hearing and became much more connected to his piano and, you know, working with people that could, you know, build these megaphones and whatever for him to actually practically get into in order to feel the sound. Now, he did not have hearing aids or cochlear implants or anything like that. You know, he was really, really listening to the body in order to connect much more with the sound. But of course, he had that advantage of having an oral beginning and understanding about pitch and harmonies and so on. But nevertheless, you know, this was an incredible example of how the human body and how the brain can shift itself um, with time, and it needs time to sort of reimagine what that sort of connection is with sound. So I feel he's, you know, we can learn so much from him. Unfortunately, we don't have videos of him and that type of thing, but we do have the ability to pause and to just think and try to imagine what that must have felt like for the likes of Beethoven. So we're not looking at a new way. We're just sort of we're trying to keep pushing the boundaries of what the brain can do and what an incredible mechanism it is, and how we can redefine perhaps the entry points to what we think our senses are and how connected they are. So the foundation really is, you know, asking or perhaps creating a landscape whereby listening belongs to us all, and it is all of our responsibilities to think what is listening in our environments. So this is nothing to do with disability or anything like that, because listening is something, as I said earlier, it's about presence. It's about an opportunity, a connection. You know, you can be with someone with no verbal ability at all, but if there is that eye connection or that physical connection somehow, that is a form of listening. We're very determined to think about listening in the written word or in the text word. We know that the vocabulary that we use and the lengths of sentences and so on, and the emojis and all of this kind of thing can have an impact on how we listen and therefore the actions that we take. And I find, for example, if I receive an email and it says, "Hey, Evelyn, as opposed to hi Evelyn or dear Evelyn, or if there's no salutation at the end, I'm less likely to give my energy towards that email just because of how it's constructed, and because I know the time will not have been taken to really think about what that email is about, and asking for someone else's time to then read that and then action a response. So that written word is absolutely crucial when we think about listening. But it's thinking about listening in our workspace. How can we be more productive, in the kind of listening environment? If you think of listening in prisons, the whole soundscape of a prison is harsh. It looks harsh and it is harsh. The materials are harsh. Metal, 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 metal. There's very little soft materials in prisons, as an example. So how does that affect people's communication, their well-being, their patience in wanting to be in a particular space, and so on? So we've done some work in prisons in the UK, and it's been quite fascinating when we redefine the space that people are in. They imagine it to be a space to do something, but not a space to be part of them, where they can tell their story in that space. So, and just as my peripatetic percussion teacher listened to my story as a 12-year-old, the foundation is determined to listen to the stories of those that we connect with, so that everybody has a voice and that voice is listened to, and therefore their purpose becomes much more meaningful in society.
We've just got a couple of minutes left, and I can't believe that we're almost at the end of an hour here. It's been fascinating, but I do have a couple of small questions here. One I'm asking on behalf of Peter Steiger, who wants to know, is there going to be another U.S. tour?
Well, goodness me. I will actually be at the Peninsula Festival in Wisconsin. This is in August of this year. I have a couple of Canadian dates, one in Ottawa in July, and Saskatoon, I think, in November, maybe October, November. The US dates are much less than they used to be. We're again, thinking about the industry that we're in. This has changed enormously since I was a young musician starting out, and then I used to tour the US a lot. In fact, so much so that I thought I might spend half the year there, living there, and half in Europe. And now, of course, it's a very different landscape again, and that's affected the industry enormously. So so yes, the States have been very, very good to me, and I'd love to do more dates there. But we also have to be mindful of the kind of climate that we're all navigating through as well.
And the last is a very simple question, but I will ask you to listen in the way that you described to this and see where that leads us. As you look back on your career so far, indeed your life, because the two are, inextricably intertwined. That's a mouthful, isn't it? What has brought you the most joy?
I think what has brought me the most joy is the ongoing curiosity. I think that has been key to the longevity of my career as a musician, but then having the kind of curiosity to think, how can the collection be of benefit, can make a difference once I'm long gone? How can the foundation make a difference once I'm long gone? So it can't just hinge on one person. So I think the curiosity for me has been completely key, and I feel very grateful to have this continued curiosity to keep going, to not feel as though, well, I've done my bit kind of thing, I'm going to put my feet up. I still have a lot of energy and a lot of curiosity um, to yes, just to continue expanding and making lots of connections. And I know that as a musician, eventually the body will physically say, I think, enough's enough here. But I'm listening to myself well enough to say, yes, I'm going to shelve that piece or whatever. So I think that what brings me joy is that sense of curiosity and the ability to listen in order to make the choices that I feel comfortable with.
Evelyn, you've been the most marvelous guest, and this is a treat for me to get to be able to talk to you, and I'm sure it will be a treat for our audience at the symposium. Thank you again so much, and thanks also to Emma for who has been very, very helpful along the way here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.